All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this session, which is part two of this data governance mixtape. All right, so this time around, again, I'm still your speaker for this particular track, Michael John Pena. I'm a Microsoft MVP for both Azure and AI, and primarily working in data space for the past, I would say 3-4 years, right? Like that's been my focus space lately. Coming from a developer background, platform background as well, right? So I've kind of like gone full circles, right? Now, for this one, there is a specific focus for us for today or tonight, wherever you are. It's about data scanning, right, or data discovery, right? Although I've already covered a little bit of that back in the previous track, but this time around we'll be focusing more about data discovery, right? So basically, the idea that I want to showcase here is that with Microsoft Purview, um, there's a really good value proposition of using Purview versus the competition, or I would say incumbent in this data governance space at the moment, mainly because of the anchoring around the Microsoft and Azure ecosystem, right? Particularly around um, Azure databases, Microsoft Fabric, Azure Databricks, and so on and so forth, right? So, like, basically, there's a lot of this interconnectivity that's been set up already, okay? But just to recap, for those who are not yet familiar with Microsoft Purview, so Microsoft Purview is a SaaS-based solution. It's a software as a service solution developed by Microsoft that kind of like caters the whole data governance, data security aspect of things, right? And again, just want to highlight that Microsoft Purview is not exclusive to the Microsoft ecosystem if, in terms of like data governance, right? So what that means is that it's also capable of scanning or cataloging other data sources as well, even on-prem data sources. Right, but for today, the focus would be around. I think these are the fundamental things that we have to cover first, right? Because these are, I would say, the low-hanging fruit. I would say in terms of like the Azure ecosystem, and most likely, and I would know this because in the field where I work, Purview is probably kind of like a in a, I would say, in a weird spot right now. We're in like some organizations have heard about it, but not everyone's adopting it yet. Right. So, um, and the idea is that, through this mixtape, I would like to kind of like educate more people about Purview, about some capabilities that it's offering, right? So that's why when I go out to the field, I think the low hanging fruits would be Azure SQL and Azure Cosmos DB, because most likely, if you're in the Azure ecosystem, most likely you are using a database of some sort, right? Primarily for relational data, you might be using any flavor of Azure SQL. Yeah, for those who don't know, there's actually different flavors of Azure SQL alone, right? We'll cover that in a bit. And then there's also different flavors of Cosmos DB, right? Or Azure Cosmos DB APIs, right? So I think, but then these two are like the hero data platforms or databases within Azure, right? And I want to focus right now around Purview and Azure SQL and Purview and Azure Cosmos DB. All right, now let's get going. So basically, the whole idea of this one is that in Purview, you have a concept of domains, and from that, that data chain consulting is the domain, and then from that you can create a collection, and from that you can register different assets, right? So that means that the collection is actually not required, but it's kind of like a good practice to kind of like group them together. Some would even create some subdomains, um, and and so on and so forth, right? And the idea around Microsoft Purview is that, again, this is kind of like a catalog of catalogs, right? So this is kind of like a tool that you would use to actually extract metadata insight or metadata information from your databases, right? So what that means is that this tool is not meant to be a database where you transfer all of your data to, right? So that's something like Microsoft Purview. So Microsoft Purview is kind of, Microsoft Fabric. So Microsoft Fabric is kind of like meant to be a modern data warehouse or lakehouse architecture, right? Purview is about governing the metadata across your different databases. All right. So again, just to educate again, that Microsoft Purview is about data security and data governance. And most likely the use case or the users of Microsoft Purview are within either the IT domain category, or I would say data domain categories, such as data stewards, data governors, and so on and so forth, right? So in some organizations where you have chief data officers, so Microsoft Purview could be one of the tools that can kind of like allow chief data officers and the data governors and data stewards to govern your data estate. All right, so that's kind of like just a prelude of Microsoft Purview. We've done quite an extensive introduction in the previous mixtape, but this time around we'll be focusing more about data scans. Now, let's do some live performance, or some majority of the time would be in me showing you actual demos, right? So, all right, now let me move into my browser. Okay, so first let's start with Cosmos DB, right? So this is just a simple Azure Cosmos DB account. Literally, I reserved the name Michael. So in whoever is, so I own the Michael Cosmos DB domain right now. I provision an the Azure Cosmos DB account under that name. Now I have a database here, or a database called Cosmic Works, and under that I have a collection called customer. All right. So in here, right, and for those who are not familiar with Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Cosmos DB is a non-relational, or I would say like a NoSQL database, right? So it's meant to store semi-structured or unstructured files. So that's why the data here is in JSON format. So things right, like you would see that this record here is this is the value, right? This is Franklin. These are, by the way, these are not real people, right? Like these are kind of like made up data. And then this other record here is that one, Rebecca Nichols, and so on and so forth, right? Now, basically, Azure for organizations, you'll be using Azure Cosmos DB to store and retrieve data, right? Especially in a transactional system. This is what you use to store data and to kind of like retrieve that information, and also maybe even edit or update the data, right? Now, in order to connect Azure Cosmos DB um, with Purview, it's very straightforward, right? And I'm here to guide you through this, right? To kind of like guide you through this journey. All right. So first off, by the way, hello to everyone in the comment section. Thank you. Yeah, feel free to keep asking questions, right? So I'll be happy to pop up some questions. All right, so going back, this is Azure Cosmos DB, right? I have a container, and I have a collection called customer, and the idea is I want to bring the metadata of this container onto Purview, right? So that means that, hey, as a data governor, I need to classify data that, hey, this first name is a name, this address is an address, right? Because in some organizations, obviously there's a regulation around in different organizations wherein you need to make sure that you annotate data, you know what your data is, and so on, right? Especially some sensitive information, such as maybe phone number can be classified as a sensitive information, right? Or PII. Okay, now, first off, before I go to Purview, right? What you would probably need to do first, okay, as a precursor of this, is that go back to your Cosmos DB account, and then go to settings and go to keys, right? Obviously, I'm not gonna show you the key. Right? The idea is you need to copy this key. All right, so you need to copy either the primary key or the secondary key, because that's the way Purview will be able to access your Cosmos DB account, right? All right, just bear with me when I say that, right? Because I know you might be thinking we might be using managed identities, service principals, and stuff. I intentionally made this simple right now so that when we go to Azure SQL, I'll show you how it's a bit different. All right, so now the idea is copy the key, okay? And then after that one, you now need to go to back to Azure, and create a Azure Key Vault. If you don't have one, you need to create a Key Vault. And then, right? So the important thing is that besides just creating a Key Vault, what you actually need is, go to objects, you need to create a secret. All right. So in secrets, this is basically where you'll be storing your key, right? Your Azure Cosmos key, right? So basically, just click generate name. Put it like like Cosmos key DB, right? Like Cosmos key 01, and then pass in the key value here, right? So that means that what that means is that when we establish the connection between Purview and Cosmos DB, although it's a um, key-based authentication, right? It's still fine because the actual key is actually stored in Key Vault, right? So Purview doesn't actually store the key itself. right? It's using key vault to retrieve the key to perform the scanning and the integration with Azure Cosmos DB. All right. Now, once we've created this one, right? Now, once we have the secret in Key Vault, now this time around is where we now need to go to Purview. Okay, so I'll do this step by step. So go to purview.microsoft.com. Again, Purview is a SaaS-based solution, so it comes with its own domain. When I say domain, like DNS, right? Like a subdomain particular. So that purview.microsoft.com is a umbrella service that is not tied into let's say slash Azure or something, right? Like this is not part of a resource within Azure. It's like a SaaS-based solution that's kind of like an umbrella product, similar to Fabric, similar to Entra, right? They're kind of like SaaS-based abstraction of services. All right, so in here, right, all you gotta do, right, would be go to Data Map, okay, and then before I showcase a lot of this, we first need to go to source management and then uh, credentials, right? So first, you need to create a credential. In particular, you need to create a key vault connection. So from that, right? So first, you need to manage a key vault connection. So let's say Cosmos KV Cosmos Con, right? And then now choose the subscription, and then from that, choose the key vault, right? So there you go. So as simple as that, you would be able to establish a key vault, I would say, integration between your Azure account and Purview, right? But I've done that already. Right? So next thing is that once you have this key vault connection, right? Now you need to set this up as a credential. All right. So what that means is that now you in Purview there are different credentials, right? There are I would say an API key, an access token, account key, basic auth, and so on and so forth, right? Like all of these are again way for you to tell Purview doesn't just store stuff unsecurely, right? This is really a way to say that, hey, in order to access something, you are basically creating a credential. And these are basically, yes, all right, yeah, good call out. Yes, managed identity is here as well. Yes, yeah. So basically, again, this is a way for you to create credentials. And what this is really doing, and the practice that it's really enticing people is that don't use your personal account, right? So don't use your login account to connect the services, right? Use credentials, right? Establish credentials because this capabilities, scanning, integration in the real world, right? When I say the real world, in production systems, you should be using service accounts. You should be using, managed identity. You should be using, like rotating keys and stuff like that. So yeah, like you need to create that credential. Right. Now, the idea here is that that particular credential for Cosmos DB is an account key. All right. So I've done that already, but basically what you would be doing is that, like create a Cosmos con 01, of course, and then change that to account key, and then go to the key vault connection that you have, which is this one, and then just type in the secret name, right? Which is, I believe the secret name is Cosmos Key. So, sorry, oh. The literally just type in the Cosmos Key secret name here, and then Purview would be able to retrieve that information and use that key as your account key. All right, so as simple as that. But I've done that already, so I have that Cosmos Con already. Now, from here, this is where, this is really where a lot of things are just a bit simpler to do, right? So now you still under data map, right? If you want to see how your domains or how your collections are mapped out or organized, you have to go to this domains tab, right? So this allows you to create a new domain, and under that you can create a collection, right? Let's say I have a new collection. Let's say Azure Databases Europe, or so on and so forth, right? Like it's really up to you on how you want to set up your your collection and domains. So there's no hard rule saying that 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 everything needs to be under a collection or a sub collection or a domain or subdomain. And it was really meant to be like that, right? Like because different organizations have different ways of handling data, right? Maybe your domain would be different, or maybe a business unit is a domain, maybe a team or a function is a domain, or maybe a squad, a tribe, a canvas, a scrum team, however you want to classify them together, right? But then the point of view here is that the um, the idea is that it's about grouping data assets, right? So it's just so happened that a lot of organizations are also tying their data assets to the business teams, right? But the idea of data mapping is about grouping together based on the data assets, right? Okay, so without further ado, let's. What I did is that I created a new collection, right? I called it Azure Databases. And then from that, you can still create a new collection under that collection and so on. So once you've created the collection, now you have to go to the data sources tab, right? All right. Actually, before I go further with the data sources tab, there's a question. Let me just answer that. Okay, so completely separate topic, maybe sorry about that. No, all good. No, there's no such thing as bad questions, right? So, but wondering when do the previous version for secret keys useful? Ideally, you might be using. Oh yeah, so yeah, it's more around a key vault question rather than a purview question. But basically, the idea of using a previous version is that let's say you're just about to rotate your keys, right? And obviously, in some organizations, like there's a threshold of like 3 days or 1 week that even if you've rotated the key, the previous key is still okay, and so on like that. But ideally, yes, use the latest version, right? Because that means it's representative of the actual key being used, right? But the thing is, in Key Vault, right, it's not just about storing keys, particularly in secrets, right? In secrets, you can store many different things. So that means that you can even put in your let's say your database name as a secret. You can put in your username as a secret. So it's not really just about access keys, right, or tokens and stuff like that. Like it's anything that you want to secure, maybe your password or and so on, right? So just to answer that one. Well, thanks for asking that one. Okay, now going back. All right, so once you've created a collection, what will happen is that under your domain, you would see this, right? So that means that, let's say I created an Azure Databases collection, and this is where the UI is a bit tricky, right? And please bear with me a little bit. So that's why I prefer the table view. It's just much more straightforward than the map view. But basically in the map view, okay, so it shows you this. Now, what you need to do is you need to register um, an asset, right? So that means that a database is an asset, a Cosmos DB database is an asset, a hard drive is an asset, a Z drive is an asset, a OneDrive folder could be an asset, right? Like anything that kind of like holds data, that's an asset, right? So now all you gotta do is you can do it via this button, register, or do it via this, right? The main difference is that if you click on this, it's implying which collection you want to add it in. So there are many data sources available at the moment. Like if you choose Azure, that basically means that metadata around Azure itself. So it's not about the database itself. It's more around like other parts of Azure, like metadata of the actual, let's say, subscription. right? Especially useful for like FinOps purposes and stuff like that. But as you can see here, right, you can register many different data sources, right? Even AWS, SQL on-prem with Arc-enabled SQL Server, KQL, Azure Databricks, Cassandra, ChatGPT Enterprise, right? There you go. Even Dataverse, Fabric, including Power BI, Oracle, and so on, right? And yeah, even Postgres, right? So the idea here is just about cataloging things, right? It's about cataloging data. Now, basically, for Cosmos, search for Cosmos, right? As of the moment, it only supports a native connection with the SQL API. But for those who don't know, Cosmos DB have many APIs, including MongoDB, right? Including Postgres, even Gremlin, and so on. But as of the moment, it only supports the SQL API, right? So what you're gonna do is register that data source, click continue, and then now try to find that data source under which subscription, and then what is the account name, which is this one, right? So I got that reserved, right? Michael, that documents at azure.com. That's me. Now add that to the collection. But I've already done that. Okay, so that's why this Cosmos DB asset is already here, right? So if I can edit this and kind of like shows you that I've already added this particular source. However, what you need to understand is that at this particular moment, you're just pointing a source. You haven't extracted metadata yet at this particular point in time, right? It's just about pointing to the source. Okay, right now the next part is actually doing the scan. All right, so now the idea is that again, when you do this is just about setting up a source. You don't have the metadata yet at this point in time. Now the next thing you have to do is go to this button and create a new scan. All right, so the scan, as you know, basically it's a very straightforward term. It's about probing your database, right? It's about, hey, I'm gonna scan my Azure Cosmos DB, and this is my capability or to do that. So, all right, basically, now this is where the credential that we've created earlier will be used, right? So that Cosmos Con is now the credential I'll be using, and then you can set up your max concurrent partition because Azure Cosmos DB is a transactional database, so you might need to be aware of that. Like application team is actually using this as well, so might affect your partitioning, right? Not really the performance, but more around like the partitioning and the cost implication as part of that. And there you go. But before that, you can test a connection, and and connection successful, right? So that means that Purview can actually authenticate through Azure Cosmos DB, and click continue. Right. Now you want to set up a scope of your scan. And from here, you can kind of like say, hey, I'm particularly scanning this, and that, right? So customers collection is the one I'm particularly scanning in here. And then the next part would be the rule set, right? So the rule set is basically a set of rules, or like the scan parameters, right? Like what sort of scanning or data approach are you performing, right? By default, there's already an Azure Cosmos DB scan. So if you view details of that one, like it kind of like sets you some classification rules around government. It's aware of like ABN. So in Australia, we have this concept of Australia business number. So it's aware of like, hey, this data looks like ABN. So I'm gonna tag it as an ABN. This data looks like ACN. So and so on, right? Um, Same goes with like personal, right? Full names, date of birth, email. So that means that this is that part where you're really auto inferring or auto magically trying to understand your data, right? So without this is that part where someone might be asking you, MJ, what's the difference of just me copying the schema into an Excel spreadsheet. Well, this is the answer, right? This is that part where basically tells you that, hey, Purview is actually able to kind of like secure or like annotate your data based off these rules, right? And again, who has the time to scan 10 gazillion rows of tables and columns and rows, right? Manually and paste them to a spreadsheet. So that's why you want to use something like Purview with a data mapping and data probing to kind of like classify those data for you, right? So I press OK. By the way, you can also create a new scan rule set. Let's say you're very explicit, like, and so on and so forth, right? Then click continue. And then this is just a scan trigger where you can kind of like make it just one-off, or is it a recurring thing you want to do every day, every month, and so on, right? So I'll just leave it as once and click continue and then save and run. All right, so once that happens, right? So this where that, that's why I'm saying that the UI is a bit tricky, right? So once that happens, now I have to go back here, right? Go back to the domains, Azure databases, and actually go to my sources and go to Cosmos DB, right? And from there, you would see, the scan, right? There's a scan tab here as well. So I've performed a scan earlier before, this stream, and obviously that was already completed, and that's what I'll be showing you, right? So this kind of like shows you these different scans, right? Now, going back to the domains, that is that part where a collection is really, really helpful. Otherwise, you might end up something like this, like you have 1,000 of assets, and it's like, it grows really, really fast and rapidly, right? In like large organization, and by the way, this is just my test tenant, right? This is not like a work tenant that I use. This is just test tenant, but like in production environment, like in actual enterprise environment, you get thousands and thousands of assets, or maybe even a million or something. All right, so now go to just Azure databases, and particularly I'm gonna go to the asset, right? And I'm gonna filter it to just the Azure Cosmos DB, and there you go. So basically, based off that scan, it was able to scan the Cosmos DB account, the database, which is Cosmic Works, and the collection, which is customer. So the interesting part really is the customer, right? So I go here, no classification at the moment, but basically that's the full point. You can edit this and basically say, hey, this customer table is classified as, like sensitive. Let's say, I'm just gonna mention, let's say it's a identity. All right, let's say just for argument's sake, it's like an identity in Chile, right? So there's a classification around that you can kind of like perform, right? And then there's these different annotations that you can do, like glossary terms. Is it certified or not certified, right? Last assessment date, last profile, and stuff like that. So this is really useful stuff for data audits, right? That would allow you to actually ensure that the organization knows their data, right? Now, okay, let me just go back here. Now, the interesting part here is the schema, right? And this is that part where I talked about earlier about that rules, and basically just performing a scan, he was able to say, hey, this is part of an all full names, it's part of all full names, and this is an email address, this is a US phone number, right? Again, because I explicitly just use that rule, and this is a physical address, right? And it has that confidence score that, hey, this is actually that, right? So that means that from a data governance point of view, or data, security point of view, that we already were able to classify this, right? And from that, let's say we can edit this, and Now I can edit in Purview on a schema level, right? That basically says, all right, so this is maybe the customer ID is something like, let's say just Australia business number, right, for now. And then the data type is that one, and there you go. Like even the data type is inferred, and as a description, you can be very explicit here as well. We're in, yeah, like, describe certain things, right? Now, in something I'll discuss in the future is about this concept of lineage, right? So about how all of this data can be connected to each other. But the important thing as well here is the context, right? Because in large organizations, especially for those who are really adopting that self-service data culture model, one way to do that is that you actually need to set up like, hey, who's the expert of this data and who's the owner of this data, right? It's just around, again, governance structure. All right. So from that, that's it. Pretty much that's kind of like the whole data mapping for Azure Cosmos DB with SQL API. All right. Now, again, just to highlight that this is not meant to get the data. This is about governing your data. This is about securing your data in a point of view of like classifying them, setting, kind of like, like capabilities. So that means that in especially highly sensitive organization and like businesses, this is just an easier way for you to do things, right? And if the developers, you would notice that because this is NoSQL, right? What could happen is that maybe the developer, hey, why did you put in the password hash here, right? Like that, you shouldn't do that, right? So that means that, I can basically say this is pass yeah, common password, right? So that means that later on, when someone kind of like do an audit, all right, so turns out we're saving the password hash in this database. So that could be a cause of concern, right? So that's why, again, it's nice to have this set of tools that would allow you to kind of like facilitate these capabilities, right? And what this also offers is a culture shift wherein you don't police the developers, right? It's kind of like a mix of proactive, reactive scenario wherein like, you don't limit the innovation wherein like, don't use this, don't use that. But like, it's about annotating it. It's about marking this as, and it's just giving visibility to the organization and especially to the data team, right? About this different data. All right, so that's for Cosmos DB. Now, let me move forward to Azure SQL, which is relatively straightforward as well. All right, now, before I go to Azure SQL, one thing I also want to encourage people doing is that creating security groups. All right, so one thing I learned when using Purview is that although Purview comes with the service principle, this thing called Purview ecosystem, right? So this is something that you already have, right? So if you go to your Entra, you would be able to see this. You already have a Purview ecosystem. Now, I would still, like again to that concept of not attaching things to a personal name and so on and so forth. I think like either create a security group and use the security group moving forward, right? So why that's handy is that I'll show you in a bit when I go to Azure SQL, right? Now, because in Azure SQL, there's an option to either use the basic authentication, which is passing in the username and password, but I want to showcase here that there's an alternative, and I would arguably say that a better approach on accessing the metadata information of the database. All right, so first, let me show you this simple SQL database. So I created an AdventureWorks SQL DB, right? One thing that, couple of things that you probably need to do as part of this is that in your server, you need to make sure that that if you go to the networking tab, you need to make sure that you would allow Azure services and resources to access the server. All right. So yeah, like just letting you know that you need this particular exception, right? Now, after doing that, all you gotta do is go to Purview. Okay. So go to Purview and go to Data Map again. And this time, all right, did I delete that? Oh, did I delete this? What happened there? All right. Oh wow. Okay, let me refresh this page. Just double checking. I didn't delete that. Okay, yeah. There you go. I'm pretty sure I didn't delete that. Anyway, so Azure databases. Okay, so from that, what I did as well is that, sorry, go back to data sources. And then from that, under the same collection, register a new source. This time, type in SQL. There are many different SQL, but particularly this Azure SQL database, right? Click on that one. Oh, by the way, you can also connect to the SQL Server level as well. So in case you want to authenticate directly to the SQL Server, you can also do that. But this one here is kind of like much specific just on the database. Now click continue. And then from that, you need to select the server name, right? And that's the endpoint. And then the collection that you want to add that in, right? Now, that's fine, right? Like when you register that, that's just gonna register that Azure SQL database. Now, again, when we perform the scan, this is where I'll show you. This is a bit seamless, right? So you can have an option of entering things manually, right? Or from an Azure subscription. In this case, I choose this particular database, AdventureWorks 777, and then the credential that I'll be using is the Microsoft Purview MSI. All right, so that means that basically this is a system account, right, or system credential. It's a managed identity, right? So I'm not gonna do lineage for now, but basically from that, you can perform the scan level that you want, right? And so on and so forth, right? Now, before by the way, I'll test the connection here and should be connection successful. All right. So how come I was, how come this connection was successful? Even though I didn't put in a password, I didn't put in, key vault, secrets, and how did that work? Because again, as I was preluding earlier, right? I do have, you and everyone have this Purview ecosystem service principal, and I added that to this security group, Purview security group. I created this. All right. Now, when I go back to Azure SQL, and when I go to this SQL Server, what I did here is that I made the Purview security group as the admin. All right. However, obviously, if you want to be much more granular, it's not really required for you to put it as an admin, right? Just for the sake of demo, I did that, right? But regardless, setting an admin through a security group is probably a good thing, right? And then maybe even later on a even database role perspective, you can also add a security group, right? Rather than the individual person's account. So that's the reason why I was able to, yeah, like set up that connection. Okay, so just to recap, Entra created a security group, added in the Purview ecosystem service principal into the security group, and then in Azure SQL, I'm SQL Server. I made the security group the admin. Hence, when I try to add that Azure SQL database as a source, I was able to connect without typing in the password, right? So, and I think it's better this way. Like you don't have to maintain a password. You know that these are like server to server communication, and like you're not storing any keys anywhere, right? It's just seamless, right? So from that, just click continue, right? Just like what we did earlier, right? You will be able to see different information for that database. Click continue, all right? And then from that one, like these are the system defaults as well for the scan rule, but you can also create a new rule if you want. Click continue, and then the trigger, do you want this to be recurring, or do you want it to be once in a while, right? So I'll choose once for now, but you might be thinking, if this is recurring, MJ, what's the cost implication of this, right? Like, how do you actually run this, or where do you run this, right? So the answer is very straightforward. So if you go to, while that's running, when you go to settings page of Purview, you would see this particular resource link, right? So this is that part where you can kind of like link this particular resource, right? So if I go here, this resource is, think of it like this is the capacity that's capable of running your Purview, right? So this is a one capacity unit. So similar to Fabric and other kind of like compute-based platforms. So it comes with the concept of capacity unit. So this one capacity unit is the one you're paying to perform this scanning, right? So that means that you can set up different, configuration and so on as part of that as well. And then that means that this is that part where you can actually create a resource, right? So if you check Purview, right, Microsoft Purview. By the way, in the future, we'll also talk about Sentinel and the whole CM concept, right? But yeah, that there's a really good overlap between Purview and that one. Now, click create, right? And from that, you would be able to, let's just say, choose that resource group, DB, yeah, and networking configuration, right? If you want to configure an event hubs, publishing consume messages, you can also do that, right? All right, that's pretty much it on creating a Purview resource. Now, going back to the data map. So now let me go back to the Azure database, and I'm gonna go to the assets, right? And I'm just gonna filter this based off the Azure SQL database this time around. And from that, I would be able to see all of my assets across that particular database, right? Again, iterate this enough. This is not your actual record. This is about your metadata of your record, right? So for example, here, actually, instead of going here, maybe let me just go to the actual database. Right? Yeah, like you can perform an edit on this particular database. You would see the properties, contacts, and so on. Right now, let me go back to this one, and you can also go on a schema level. Right, you can perform like a classification on a schema level, and that's very useful, especially for other organizations who are kind of like adopting this kind of like staging approach with your data, right? So you can apply classification on a schema level. All right, now let me go to, let's say, this particular table. Maybe let's say customer. All right, now in the schema tab, you would be able to see again, a lot of these classifications are filled in already, right? But as you would see, hey, password here is, it's not actually classified, so you need to edit that as well. Right? And then password hash, make this password common passwords, right? And save that. Okay. Also, you can do a bulk edit if you want, right? Yeah, like for example, if you want to edit a bunch of different things all at once, and like let's say they're the same classification and so on, you can also do the bulk edit. Now, what I also want to check is the I want to edit this one, and I want to edit the classification, right? That hey, this is, oh, by the way, that one is interesting. So if I go to Azure Database, then go to address, if I go to schema, yeah, there you go. So it's also aware of cities. So I was able to infer that that this particular field is world cities. Right? So very useful stuff as well. Um, yeah, so that's about it really for in terms of like this particular track. Just want to highlight about this whole scanning capability, about metadata extraction, and so on, right? Especially for those who are still new to this space. Again, this is a way, it's like a new wave of requirements happening all over the world about making sure you understand your data. It's about, making sure that you protect your data and like you set up classification here and there, right? Because the reality is there's just so much data out in the wild right now. And one of the things we'll focus on as well in the future is that Copilot, right? Like, and Chat GPT and stuff like that. We're in like, if we use Purview to kind of like classify sensitive information, then basically, we can tell Copilot to not to not use that as part of your data extraction, right? So that's why um, I'm a big advocate of like before going to the whole hype of AI and just going out in the wild like without really understanding things. A lot of these fundamentals and foundations are really important, right? Um, because that just means that like storing your data in Fabric is one foundation. Second is that unifying your catalogs with Purview is another way for you to understand your data assets, right? Especially later on when I talk about lineage and stuff like that. But again, these are kind of like the new ways of the new world of requirements happening around, right? And you might be thinking, again, this MJ, this looks a bit silly. This is a bit straightforward, but that's the point, right? Because a lot of these data people or analysts usually have some jobs to do, and having this kind of like tools would be really handy, right? Yeah. So that's it for today tonight. But I'll give you some taste of what's gonna happen in the future or like the future track that we'll be covering. So in Purview, there are so many solutions besides data map, right? So there's data policy, there's audit, there's communication compliance, DLPs, right? So this will be a continuous track until whenever, right? So it just keeps going and going. But basically, the data map is the fundamental solution that you first have to do. And then after that one, that's where you go to these other solutions. And that's where you would really see like some really good values and like some really I would say a bit advanced capabilities that Purview really offers. All right, so with that, thank you very much for your time. If there are any questions, please do let me know. Other than that, well, it's been a pleasure presenting live. um, yeah, and I hope to see you in the next track. All right, unless there are any questions.